Hello students, I hope everybody is well. I'm doing well over here. I hope we get together soon. Listen, speaking of getting together, I wanted to let you know that I would like to next week try to do a Zoom meeting. All right, so we could get together over Zoom. I'm assuming you're doing that for some of your other classes. And so if we got together on a regular meeting time, that would be Wednesday. That would be the 22nd of April. And at 9:30. Okay, it wouldn't be for the lecture. The lecture I'll go ahead and send that to you ahead of time, so you can watch that at your own time. But at the class time, just for a little bit, maybe 30 minutes or so. If you had any questions, I could at least see your faces, right? So I've been missing seeing y'all. So let's try to do that, and I will send information along the way as far as the Zoom code and all that kind of thing. So that'll be not this week, but next week. Okay, great. Sounds good. We're on Module 14B. I have received quizzes from 13 for some of you, but not all of you. I know we're still working through that, the strategy to get all that to me and everything like that. So we'll keep working on it. Okay, so today we're looking at the respiratory system. Last week we looked at the circulatory system, and that is about how the blood gets around the body, right? And now closely tied to that is the respiratory system, because the blood needs something and it's taking something to the cells. And what it's taking, of course, is oxygen. All right, so the oxygen has to get into the blood somehow, right? And this is how it happens. It happens in the lungs. You can see our little animation over here to the right, where the muscles moving up and allowing air to rush into the lungs. So we'll get to that, and we'll see how the mechanics of breathing work, and then furthermore how the biochemistry of getting blood to the cells works. All right, so we're going to get started here. This is our first blank to fill in right here. The blood is the transport system for oxygen. So you're going to write that down in your blank. You could put, see how I have in parentheses there, O2. So instead of writing out oxygen each time, you can write O2 if you like. So it's transporting oxygen throughout the body. As you know, the body needs oxygen in order to make ATP. Remember, ATP is adenosine triphosphate, which is our source of energy. And so all of life really is about how are we going to get energy to our body. So we need a couple of things. We need some glucose, so that's our food. That's the sugar, if you will. And we need oxygen. Those two things together will go through a complex system of biochemical events to make ATP. All right, so we're going to look at how that oxygen gets into the blood cells. Remember our blood cells. We have 3 different kinds. This is a little bit of a review, and I believe your book has a couple of blanks to fill in as well. All right, so we have platelets. We'll see today what platelets are good for. All right, well, we have talked about that, right, about blood clotting, and we'll mention that again. Another name for platelets is thrombocytes. You're welcome to use that word if you like. You don't have to, but platelets will do. We have red blood cells, also known as erythrocytes, and we can call them RBCs, right? RBC for red blood cell. We know about those from last week. And then, of course, our white blood cells, or leukocytes, and we have those different ones, right? The 5 different types of white blood cells, or WBC, out there. And we discussed those last time, and pretty fascinating stuff. And so we're going to key in today, of course, on the red blood cells, because those are the ones that are responsible for carrying the oxygen. We will get back to white blood cells when we talk about the immune system, all right, because they are key in that, of course. And we will have a little bit of discussion about viruses and how we fight viruses, seeing as how that is the plague that we're facing right now. All right, blood clotting. We have a little blank here on your page. By the way, we're on page 67. So it asks, how does blood clot and close an injury yet does not clot in your bloodstream? Good question. So platelets actually begin the process of agglutination, and we talked about that last time. Agglutination is a fancy word for clotting. There is a site of trauma. Remember the video from last week? Something happens, a breach, a cut, or something like this. And a process begins to form a fibrin clot. There's a cascade of biochemical events that takes place, and it's very fancy and very elaborate so that clots don't form all by themselves. Okay, that would be a dangerous situation if we had clots just forming in your blood vessels, because then they could block little blood vessels and things like that. Remember, we talked about a heart attack. If the little blood vessel in your brain is blocked by a clot, that's what's known as a stroke. So it's important that we don't have blood clots just racing around through our blood. So this clot forms in a cut. We see it here. The fibrin is finally made, and it forms a net. You saw a picture of that last week, and the net captures some of those red blood cells and then fills that up. Now, meanwhile, this tissue is going through a healing process. And as it heals and heals, it gets closer and closer together. The clot will dissolve and go away. So the body has a way of doing that process of dissolving the clot. That's important. When everything's working correctly, the clot will not travel through the body to block vital organs. Okay, so the clot will just dissipate, it'll dissolve, and all those parts can be reused for other things. All right, so in your blank right there, you can just say that that the process is so fancy that the clots will form where they need to and dissolve when they're not needed anymore. Let's watch a little video. This is going to just give us an overview of how this is working and the oxygen portion and everything.
You breathe in about 17,000 times per day. It's a process you rarely think about, but behind the scenes, a huge coordinated effort is playing out. Your vital organs, the gut, brain, bones, lungs, blood, and heart, work together to sustain your life by delivering oxygen to tissues throughout your body. Most of our cells need oxygen because it's one of the key ingredients of aerobic respiration. That's the process that produces a molecule called ATP, which our cells use to power their many incredible functions. But getting oxygen throughout our bodies is a surprisingly difficult task. Gas enters cells by diffusing in from their surroundings, and that only happens efficiently over tiny distances. So, for oxygen to reach the cells within our bodies, it needs a transportation network. This is where our 20 trillion red blood cells come in. Each one contains about 270 million oxygen-binding molecules of hemoglobin, which is what gives blood its scarlet hue. To make these cells, the body uses raw materials that become available from the food we eat. So in some ways, you could say that oxygen's journey through the body really begins in the gut. Here, in an amazing display of mechanical and chemical digestion, food gets broken down into its smallest elements. Like iron, the building block of hemoglobin. Iron is carried through the cardiovascular system to the body's hematopoietic tissue. This tissue is the birthplace of red blood cells, and it can be found enclosed within our bone marrow cavities. The kidneys regulate our levels of red blood cells through the release of erythropoietin, a hormone which causes marrow to increase production. Our bodies churn out roughly 2.5 million red blood cells per second, a number equivalent to the entire population of Paris, so that oxygen that makes it to the lungs will have ample transportation. But before oxygen can even reach the lungs, the brain needs to get involved. The brainstem initiates breathing by sending a message through your nervous system, all the way to muscles of the diaphragm and ribs. This causes them to contract, thus increasing the space inside the ribcage, which allows the lungs to expand. That expansion drops your lungs' internal air pressure, making air rush in. It's tempting to think of our lungs as two big balloons, but they're actually a lot more complicated than that. Here's why. The red blood cells in the vessels within your lungs can only pick up oxygen molecules that are very close to them. If our lungs were shaped like balloons, air that was not in direct contact with the balloon's inner surface couldn't diffuse through. Luckily, our lungs' architecture ensures that very little oxygen is wasted. Their interior is divided into hundreds of millions of miniature balloon-like projections called alveoli that dramatically increase the contact area to somewhere around 100 square meters. The alveolar walls are made of extremely thin, flat cells that are surrounded by capillaries. Together, the alveolar wall and capillaries make a 2-cell thick membrane that brings blood and oxygen close enough for diffusion. These oxygen-enriched cells are then carried from the lungs through the cardiovascular network, a massive collection of blood vessels that reaches every cell in the body. If we laid this system out end to end in a straight line, the vessels would wrap around the Earth several times. Propelling red blood cells through this extensive network requires a pretty powerful pump, and that's where your heart comes in. The human heart pumps an average of about 100,000 times per day, and it's the powerhouse that ultimately gets oxygen where it needs to go, completing the body's team effort. Just think, this entire complex system is built around the delivery of tiny molecules of oxygen. If just one part malfunctioned, so would we. Breathe in. Your gut, brain, bones, lungs, blood, and heart are continuing their incredible act of coordination that keeps you alive. Breathe out.
Okay, that's actually a really very informative video. It's very, very good. That's pretty much everything you need to know. So, but I guess I'll continue on. Okay, so the anatomy of the respiratory system is found, in your head and chest. So it starts up where you're going to bring air in. All right, so we're going to bring air in through our nose and through our mouth. So keep in mind that, remember, our esophagus is right behind our trachea. Okay, so the trachea is right here. It's also known as the windpipe, and the windpipe is nice and open all the time. So it has very strong cartilaginous rings of material there that always keep it open. You can imagine it's important, right, for our trachea to be open all the time, so we can be breathing all the time even when we're not thinking about it, right? We don't want that to collapse down. And in fact, it's very difficult for the trachea to collapse because of those rings of cartilage. They stay open all the time. The esophagus, on the other hand, is flat. It's completely flat until you put food into it. All right, you put food into it, it takes peristalsis and moves that down to your stomach, right? And remember, we talked about back in the digestive unit about the little flap here that closes. Remember, we watched that video of a person swallowing and that little flap would close so that the food would go down the esophagus. Yeah, well, that's called the epiglottis right here, the epiglottis. And at that time, we talked about if somebody's choking, how you can help to get the material out of their larynx, out of the top of their trachea, in order to stop the choking. And I told you we'd talk about it later. Well, here's where we're going to talk about it. So we'll watch a little video near the end of our lecture today about the Heimlich maneuver and how to get somebody unchoked. Okay, so because really choking is a problem with the respiratory system rather than the digestive system, although typically what we choke on is something we're eating, right? So that's part of the digestive system. So remember this right here, the epiglottis, that's the little flap that closes. And we'll watch, like I said, a little video about that. Okay, so as we breathe in through our nose, remember our sense of smell is right up in here. When we talk about the brain, I think we're going to start talking about the nervous system next week because we move module 16 up, and that has to do with our rat dissection. Okay, so we up here there are specialized cells that when we breathe in deeply, the cells will dissolve, and we can smell. Okay, so our sense of smell, that's right there. We have our sense of taste here. We breathe in. It goes right down into our trachea right here. We'll look at some of that anatomy a little closer, and it goes down into our two lungs. All right, so we have two lungs, one on either side. We're going to see actually on our lab today, I'll be dissecting something known as pluck, P-L-U-C-K, and pluck is the trachea and lungs of a critter. So you'll get to see that today in our little lab. And then we have our bronchi and then our bronchioles that go and fill up the tissue of the lungs. All right, so like the video was saying, I always tell my students, don't think of the lungs like balloons. Think of the lung more like sponges. So you know how a sponge has all those little holes in it? So our lungs are very similar, and what those little holes are the little bronchioles, the very small bronchi, the little tubes, ending with little tiny balloons. All right, so a bunch of little tiny balloons, which helps increase the surface area. And we'll get to those little tiny balloons because that's an important thing for you to know. But the general anatomy looks like this. Okay, so mostly we have our trachea, our bronchioles, our bronchioles, and then, of course, the lung tissue itself. We're going to watch a little video now about the how respiration goes.
The respiratory system moves air through the nose, pharynx, larynx, trachea, and bronchus to the alveoli where the gas exchange between oxygen and carbon dioxide occurs. Nares are the openings to the nose. The nasal cavity is lined with cilia, mucous membranes, and blood capillaries. The air is filtered by cilia, moistened by mucous membranes, and warmed by the blood. Air moves into the pharynx or throat, the common passageway for food and air. Air continues on to the larynx. The epiglottis, a flap of tissue in front of the larynx, closes off the larynx when swallowing to prevent food from entering. The larynx or voice box contains the vocal folds. The trachea or windpipe connects the larynx to the bronchial tree. The cartilage rings of the trachea prevent the trachea from collapsing. Lungs are spongy tissue with alveoli and blood capillaries. Breathing occurs because of the expansion and contraction of the lungs. The bronchi carrying the air subdivide into smaller branches called bronchioles. At the end of each bronchiole are the alveolar sacs. The alveolar sacs are surrounded by blood capillaries and contain millions of single-layer alveoli cells where the gas exchange takes place. Oxygenated air goes from the nose to the pharynx, larynx, trachea, bronchus, and alveoli. By the process of diffusion, oxygen in the air moves from the alveoli to the capillaries. Carbon dioxide moves from the capillaries to the alveoli and is exhaled. This process is called respiration.
Okay. There we go. So the word is alveoli, okay, and alveolar. So he said it kind of funny. So our respiratory system, here we go. We're going to be filling in some of the blanks here. Your two lungs will wrap around your heart. All right, so heart is that blank right there. The left lung is slightly smaller with two lobes to make room for the heart. So it actually is accommodating the space for the heart there. That's on the left side. So our heart, which is generally in the center, sort of protrudes out to the left, which is why we put our hand on the left side of our chest when we're saying the Pledge of Allegiance and stuff like that. We can actually feel the heart beating a little stronger on that side because, furthermore, remember what we know about the left side of the heart. It's stronger and bigger on that side because it's got a pump to the whole body. Remember that? The right lung, however, has three lobes, so it has a little more room in there on the right side. Each lung has about 350 million alveoli. So that word is written for in your book. You may want to circle that or highlight it or something like that. It's an important word to remember. The alveoli are responsible for exchanging gases. Okay, those gases will be oxygen and carbon dioxide. So O2 and CO2. You're going to be filling in the word gases. Our lungs can hold approximately 3 liters of air. If we had been together, I would have brought my little lung capacity kit and I asked for a volunteer to blow into the bag as much as you can and see how much lung capacity you might have. But we're not doing that today. Adults breathe about 15 to 20 breaths per minute. That's at rest. If you start to have any physical exertion or activity, it's kind of interesting. Our brain automatically increases our heart rate and increases our respiration rate. And that's because as we are moving around and running or whatever exercise we're doing, our cells are using up the oxygen, all right? They're using up the oxygen. We need to make more, and we need to make more ATP. So we need more oxygen to come in so we can, therefore, make more ATP. All right, I think that might be the end of your your notes right here, but I have all sorts of, we're going to talk about some details of the system. So we're continuing here, so you can just relax and listen. All right, notice in that one video, it was called the bronchial tree. This right here is some lungs where the lung tissue is gone, but the tubes are all left behind right here. So kind of interesting looking. You can kind of see why it's called a tree. Kind of looks like a tree, doesn't it? So it starts up here at the trachea, and they mentioned, we'll get to it here in a minute, right here at the top of the trachea is something called the larynx, and the larynx is what houses the voice box, and that's how we make sound. That's how we speak, sing, and that kind of thing. All right, so the trachea comes down right here. Oh, I've lost my pointer. There it is, comes down. And then we have a bronchus, a main bronchus, and there's two of them, one on the left and one on the right. I guess this is the left, right, the left and the right. And then they branch off into secondary bronchi, so those are these right here, okay? So bronchi is just the plural of the word bronchus. And then they get really small into the smallest ones called the bronchioles. And I think in our video later, I accidentally call them brachials, so sorry about that. They're bronchioles. And then at the very, very tippy end right there, you can kind of see the little terminal right there, little bubbles. Those would be our alveoli, okay? The alveoli are the functional unit of the respiratory system. That's where the action takes place. The trachea and all the way through all the bronchi and bronchioles are lined with cilia. Now, cilia are specialized cells that look like little hairs, and what they're doing, there are a couple of things they're doing. One is they're moving things along, all right? So you think about it, it's good to move air along, but it's not really moving air along. If you've had a cold before and you start coughing, you know how sometimes there's some mucus associated with that? Well, the interior of our bronchioles have some mucus in there, and that mucus is doing something important. One of the things it's doing is capturing things that are not supposed to be there. All right, so if we breathe in some bacteria, it'll capture those bacteria, and then it'll let the immune system come take care of it. So it'll get stuck in that mucus. So when you get sick, there's more mucus, and you might think, ugh, this is gross. Well, it's important, right? And the cilia move it along. So it keeps moving and keeps moving. When you have an overload of it, sometimes you'll need to cough to help to move it along some. Okay, so the musculature of coughing will help that. But these cilia are really great. They move around like little hairs, keep things moving along, and keep our system healthy to bring in air. Our lungs really like only to have air coming into them. They don't like other things coming in. So if you've been standing around like a bonfire or something, and you get a breath of some of the smoke, and it makes you cough, doesn't it? So our lungs will cough to get rid of stuff that's something besides air. If you've taken a drink too quickly sometimes and you kind of choke on that, that's because your lungs don't want liquid in there. Although we'll see there's actually liquid in our lungs. It's just very specialized. In fact, it's along here with that mucus, right? There's some liquid part of mucus there. So that's what those cilia look like. Here's our alveoli. Okay, so an alveoli would be one of these one little circles here, okay? So notice there's a bunch here. They kind of look like a bunch of grapes, don't they? So they gather together in these little groups here. And each alveolus, that would be the singular there, each alveolus is a very thinly membraned wall right here, very thin membrane wall right here. And then these blood vessels come in. Look, we know what those blood vessels are called, right? Those are our capillaries, right? And the capillaries are going to be touching the outside of this thin wall of the alveolus, and you're going to see there's going to be very, very useful for gas exchange. All right, so the gas exchange takes place in the alveoli. That's plural because we have millions of them. Alveolus would be the singular. So if I ask you the question, what is the functional unit of the respiratory system? Functional unit would be the thing that does the work we're looking for. And what are we looking for? Gas exchange. So the thing that does the work is the alveoli. Okay, so that would be the answer to that question. If we get in close to one alveolus, you can see that there's a blue part. This is air coming in, okay? I guess this arrow is representing air. This is representing CO2 going out. Notice these red cells are coming into this very tiny capillary. In fact, this capillary is so small that only one can fit in at a time. They go single file. That is tiny, right? We talked about that last time. So because it's so tiny, then they can touch up against this cell membrane, the membrane of the blood vessel, and then the membrane of the alveolus right here. All right, and then there's really nothing to really stop the oxygen from going in. Now, what makes the oxygen go in to the red blood cell? Well, they come in, remember the blue and red, which is not exactly accurate. These cells don't have much oxygen in them because it's been used. So when they come along here, they get rid of their CO2, right? Because there's not very much CO2 in here. So there's more CO2 on this side than there is on this side. So by a process known as osmosis, it just goes out all by itself. Same thing happens here. There's not very much oxygen in these cells. So lots of oxygen out here, you just breathe it in, right? That will automatically, through the process of osmosis, just move across those thin membranes and go right into the red blood cell. And the red blood cell, we know, is holding on to that with those little hemes, right? Those little iron molecules are holding on to the oxygen right there. This shows a little animation of it. See how they're squeezing in, the oxygen going in, the CO2 going out. Yeah, I like the way those little red cells are changing color from the purple to the red, right? So we see that oxygen going in. Very cool. Very cool. So what happens when we have a problem with our lungs? Okay, I talked a little bit ago about if we had a cold or something like that. A very bad cold, and some people, of course, from this viral infection that's going on right now are developing something known as pneumonia. Typically, pneumonia means there's some sort of infection. Most of the time it's bacterial. We have bacteria growing in our lungs. You know, we breathed it in somewhere and got sick. And what will happen is that our body will start to fight that off. And by fighting it off, it'll send a lot of fluid in there, including white blood cells and things like this. Well, sometimes there's too much fluid coming in. So the fluid starts to fill up the alveoli. So you see that fluid in there. Now, if there's fluid in here, am I going to be able to have gas exchange in these alveoli right here? No. Where I had it right here, fluid is in the way. So kind of like drowning, right? So that would drown those little alveoli at that point in time. So what we have to do is do some treatments, and what doctors will typically do, first of all, is try to get rid of the bacteria, so they use an antibiotic or something. If it's viral pneumonia, it's a little more difficult because viruses, we don't kill those, they are not alive, so we have to deal with those typically through time. We just have to wait and wait for them to finish out their life cycle, which is a life cycle once it's entered your cells. And then we try to get that fluid to come out. There are certain drugs out there that will actually pull fluid out of vessels. They're called diuretics. And those are helpful in a situation like this. All right. Asthma is another condition that takes place with some people. Typically, asthma is a genetic disorder. You've inherited it. And sometimes children will have it, and they'll grow out of it. So they'll have it as children, and then as they grow older, they'll grow out of it. So you can see right here, a normal airway. Here's the alveoli right here, right, bringing the oxygen in, and it comes in, and we have musculature, so there's muscles along this. That's to keep everything moving, right? Mostly that mucus and stuff that's inside, that little layer right there is like the mucus and the cilia that are in there. So there's musculature. These are actual muscle bands right here to keep things moving along. So the air is going to come through, and if it needs muscular help, it'll happen. So if there's someone with asthma, you can see right here what happens is that thickens that muscular area right there, becomes more thickened, and it starts to push in the airway. So where we have a lot of area in the airway here, we have less area here, which is going to slow down the process of the air moving through. Okay, so a person with asthma will have generally their bronchioles looking like this, and if they have an attack, they'll even get more compact. See, so an attack means, look at these muscles, what they're doing. They're all tightened up, and it just causes this constriction of this area right here, making it much narrower spot right here, which causes the patient at this point to have difficulty breathing. They have, this kind of sucking in where it sounds like they're wheezing and things like this. And that's because they have much less passageway for the air to come through. Healthy lungs look like this on the left right over here, nice and pink, all right, because we're going to have that blood in there, right? Blood is red, and so we see our heart right here, which is going to be pushing all that blood around inside those lungs, and the lungs are getting oxygenated. They're nice pink spongy tissue right there. Now, this right here is called smoker's lung. Cigarette smoke, you breathe that into your lungs, and it has stuff in it called tar, and the tar actually will end up collecting up inside the cells of your lungs, inside the alveolar sacs. So if my alveoli are filled with this goopy tar, this black tar, how well do you think I can breathe? Not well at all. So if you want to smoke cigarettes, you're going to ruin your lungs eventually. Furthermore, those cells will be changed sometimes, and that change will cause something known as lung cancer. And so that can be a problem. So here's what I'll tell you. My advice to you: no smoking, y'all. It's bad for you. There's nothing good about smoking. It's gross, and it ruins your lungs and can cause cancer. All right, so that's my preaching for the day. No smoking. So to get the oxygen in, this is pretty cool. We have several muscles that worked for breathing. And it might surprise you just a little bit right here. There's a muscle just beneath your rib cage called the diaphragm. It actually stretches from one side all the way over to the other. It's completely cutting your body in half. Okay, so there's it's creating a chamber in here called the, where's my pointer? There it is, called the pleural chamber. All right, and it's keeping your lungs really pushed right against your ribs all the time. And so what we'll do is when we're taking a breath, when you breathe in, your diaphragm actually moves down. Now when it moves down, it actually makes this pleural space larger. And when that space becomes larger, we'll look at a little model of it here. When it becomes larger, that means that air will rush in. So sometimes you might think that I'm sucking air in by breathing, but not really. What you're doing is you're just increasing the volume of your chest, which then will allow the gases to come rushing in. And then when we breathe out, our diaphragm relaxes and goes up, making the pleural space smaller. Okay? All right, and that's how we breathe. Now, there are other muscles there as well. Do I have a picture of that? Okay, well, this shows the diaphragm again. Okay, so breathing in, the diaphragm actually moves this way, making a bigger space. Breathing out, diaphragm goes in that way, making a smaller space. And therefore, the air will just rush out. Okay, so the air is coming in by a process just known, it's really the laws of gases. When my volume increases, the gases will rush in. Okay, do I show? Yes, here are the other muscles that are part of this. These are called the respiratory muscles of the chest, because when you're breathing normally, pretty much it's your diaphragm doing all the work, and you can see it here. It's all right up in here, and it completely seals off the top part of your body from the bottom part, and that's important. Okay, because right here, for this to work, this has to be completely sealed. So in truth, that's really like a vacuum in there. It really is. Okay. So, but when you're breathing normally, your diaphragm is what's working. But sometimes you want to take a deep breath, right? So take a deep breath. When you breathe in, you're actually using these other muscles. Okay, we have external intercostal muscles, internal intercostal muscles. We actually use the sternocleidomastoid muscle, which we know about that from our muscle unit right there. We have our pecs, our pectoralis minor muscles, and our thoracic muscles. All of these are doing for that, because also what we'll do is if you take a big breath in and then you just release it, so, and then release, but then keep releasing and keep blowing. Keep blowing. Those are other muscles that help with the exhalation. So the muscles, some muscles like the intercostals will help with the inhalation, and other muscles like our thoracic muscles will help with the exhalation. All right, so lots of muscular action going on there. But if you're breathing just normally, it's mostly just your diaphragm. So our voice box is right there at the top of the trachea. In fact, if there's choking taking place, it usually happens in the larynx right here. Notice there's a little thin area. So something can get caught right in there and cause choking. So we produce our voice when we push air past the delicate folds of our larynx. They're called vocal cords. And it causes the air to vibrate. And then we move our mouth around and our muscles around in our throat to cause the different sounds that come out, right? So by changing the length and thickness. So we're going to actually see a little video here of somebody who is getting their vocal cords checked out. All right, probably it's, here's what they look like. So when I'm breathing in, the vocal cords are open. This is when I'm not speaking. Okay, so when you're just sitting there, not talking like y'all are right now, this is what your vocal cords look like. But when you start to speak, they'll actually close up. That's called adducting. and they will start to vibrate when I push air through there. So the next video here is going to show, I believe it's probably a singer or some professional like that who's being checked out to see why what's going on with the vocal cords. Okay, it's kind of, you might find it a little creepy.
Pitch.
This is the epiglottis.
Pitch very soft.
Good.
Good, a little louder. Louder still. And again now. Good, now say he, he, he. Nice loud he. And again. Once more. Try a real high pitch. Now give me a singing. At a low pitch and then sing up. Okay, can you go any further? Okay, good. And now high to low.
How they change.
All right, say he, he, he.
All right, a little bit creepy, right? I'm glad it stuck here like this. So you saw that there's a trachea, really cool. How the vocal cords were vibrating right there. All right, notice when from the low note to the high note, how those stretched out to get high, right, and got really shorter to make the low notes. All right, so that's how we manipulate our voice, by changing the length of those vocal cords. Now the larynx is made of cartilage, so all this area here is cartilaginous. And it turns out that male hormones cause this cartilage to get larger, which is why men typically have Adam's apples, right? And women typically don't. Furthermore, men typically have lower voices. That's because their larynx is larger, and they have a larger vocal cord that can have that range right there. So pretty cool. This brings us to choking. So I liked that video that did show the epiglottis closing when the food came down. So here comes food, right? It's coming into the mouth, down the esophagus. Right, here's the esophagus. This flap closes. Well, now and then that flap will fail. All right, and when that flap fails, some of that food can make it down into the airway. Now, it should show that the larynx is right here, which is a pretty small hole right there. And so, of course, immediately we try to start coughing. But if the coughing, if the choking material gets lodged in there too firmly, then even our coughing, we won't be able to cough. All right, so the thing you need to know about if somebody is choking, the universal sign of choking, some people think it's putting my hands around my throat, but that's not necessarily the case. Somebody who is having a heart attack might have pain that comes up through their neck, and they might be holding on to their neck area. Here's the thing to look for: if there's no sound at all coming from them, no sound. So they're sometimes if they're groaning or something, their airway's open, don't you? Because they have sound coming through. But if there's no sound coming through, then that airway might be blocked. Okay, so we might be looking at someone who is choking at this point. So it's important to get that stuff out. So we're going to watch a little video on how to perform the Heimlich maneuver on someone who's choking.
So what do you do when someone's choking? Say you and a friend are out in a restaurant and all of a sudden they start choking. So I'm going to have my friend Hannah come over here. And we're out, we're having a good time, we're eating, and all of a sudden she seems like she's choking. First you ask, are you okay? And oftentimes the international sign for choking is this, okay? They're like, I can't breathe, something's going on. If you're around other people, you want to get them to help you. You want to, if you're in a restaurant or a place of business, have someone, call out for help and have the people help you out. Tell them what you're doing. Don't just attack them, because that will just heighten their anxiety and their panic. So what you're going to do is you're going to stand behind them, and you're going to wrap your arms all the way around, okay? And you want to you find their belly button with your pinky, make a fist, put the pinky on the belly button, then roll it up so your thumb is, the knuckle of your thumb is right there, and then you thrust. You pull it in and up, and I'm not going to do it as hard. In and up until they can dislodge what is in there and they can breathe again. Don't go crazy like in the movies and start slapping their back and like wrestling. Sometimes people get carried away and they want to slap your back and they just end up hurting you. If the person is pregnant or a larger person, and you can't get your arms all the way around to where their belly button is, you're going to want to go higher up to where their breastbone is. So say Hannah is pregnant. Congratulations. You wrap around, you find their breastbone, and then you just do the same thing. In and up until they dislodge whatever is in their throat and they can breathe again. If the person is so big, if you're a small person and you have a big strapping person with you who's choking and you just can't even do that, you can assist them into doing a self-Heimlich maneuver on a chair or a surface that will get to their diaphragm. You just lean them over and kind of talk them through it. Stay calm. The more panicky you get, the more panicky they're going to get. They're already in a state of anxiety because they can't breathe, which is normal. So if they lose consciousness and they fall to the floor, you're going to lay them down, you're going to roll them over, and then you're same thing. You're going to find the belly button, roll up, and you're going to thrust while they're on the floor until that comes out or until help arrives. Continue trying to do the thrusts and trying to get them to get that out of their throat so they can breathe again, and just stay with them until help arrives.
All right. Hopefully you'll never find yourself in a position to need to use that information on anyone else or yourself. Okay. For babies, it's a little bit different. We have to be very careful with babies, right? You don't want to crush them. I mean, they're very tender material. Their diaphragm is very tender as well. So you place them on their stomach, down across your forearm, and give them 5 quick, forceful blows with the palm of your hand or the heel of your hand right there, and try to get that out right there. All right, and call 911, of course. Okay, so this brings us to what you have this experiment in your book. 14.2, I guess, and it's making up a lung model. So this is really easy. I would have had these materials for you today where you just have a plastic bottle, you cut the bottom off of it, okay, and you stretch kind of a large balloon across the bottom of it, and then you put a smaller balloon in through here. There are fancier ones. If you go online, you can see some fancy ones that use straws that have 2 balloons coming off, so therefore you have the 2 lungs. And that's fine if you want to try something like that. If you do make this, go ahead and take a picture and send that to me, okay? I'll get you some extra credit for that. So what happens if you pull on the diaphragm, if you pull down on that, it actually inflates the balloon in here, okay? It shows you that by increasing the area inside here, by making this bigger, by pulling that down, it actually allows air to rush in and fill that balloon up. So it's pretty cool, all right? So give that a try. What's the second experiment? It says 14.2 and 14.3. Oh, wait, this is 14.4. So there are some other ones. You know what these are? These are the breathing ones. What I would have had for you is I have a bag you blow into, and then we can measure how much breathing was in there. So I think those 2 might be the ones that show your vital capacity of your lungs. Okay, and now I'm looking at your book here. It says 14.4 is actually some sort of experiment with xylem. Xylem is something in plants. All right, let's not worry about that right now. We're just going to key in on the body and the things that are going on inside the body. Okay, so here is our pluck dissection. I'm going to go through this with a video and show you what's going on. Sadly, the video cuts out at the end, so you don't get to see all of it. And the reason is my phone, which I was recording this on my phone, was so full that it said I can take no more stuff. So I had to go in and fix my phone and delete a bunch of stuff and that kind of thing. So you might be experiencing the same kind of thing. So it's fixed now and everything, but I had already finished doing the dissection. I didn't really know that I had missed the second half of the dissection. So this is the heart. This comes from a sheep, by the way. Here are the lungs right here and the trachea. All right, so ready? Here we go. All right, I think we're going. So this is our specimen. It's called pluck. All right, so you may wonder, what in the world is pluck? Well, it's when we have the lungs, the heart, and the trachea, all these parts put together right here. Okay, so I'm going to turn it over this way. Remember, this is from a sheep. And because it's from a sheep, they walk like this, right? So their lungs are on the top and their heart is on the bottom. For humans, we walk upright like this, so our heart would actually be a little more nestled within the lungs like this a little bit, if I'm still in camera. Okay, so you can see on this side, you can clearly see the heart. We did this last week. Looked just like that, didn't it? We cut that and opened it up. And now what we're going to key in on this week are the lungs and the trachea. All right, so I'm going to start here. Let's start with the trachea. Hopefully you can see this. What I want you to see is it's a tough tube, right? It's very hard to squish the whole thing down. All right, see, I can't even get that all the way closed right there. And you'll see how we have this C-ring right here of the cartilage right underneath. Has the soft spot right there. And so if we were together, I'd have you put your hand in there and see how strong that was. All right, it's going to come all the way down and meet up with our lungs. All right, so here's our two lungs, right? And they have different lobes. Here's a lobe of the lung. And here's a lobe right there. All right. And on the other side, I've got a lobe, small one, right there. Okay? Making it accommodating for the heart to be in there. That's why it's the one fewer lobe over here, just like on human lungs. Okay, so we'll see. This is like the septum in between. Looks like some fatty tissue right there. And I'm going to go ahead and cut into this lung so you can see, like I told you, don't think of the lung like a balloon. Think of the lung more like a sponge. So I'll show you. I'm going to cut right here where it looks like the entrance, the trachea comes down, and it's going to into the brachials, right? So the bronchi, and then down to the smaller brachials right there. I'm not sure how much you can see right now, all right? But I'm going to cut that right there. In fact, I'm going to cut right through some of these really large holes. I'm going to turn it this way so you can see maybe, hopefully, a little better. Oh, actually, you probably can see that hole pretty well, right? There's a hole right there. And then a hole reaching here into our tissue of our lung. So I'm going to cut that tissue open. This is one of the neatest, least smelly specimens of pluck I've ever had. Usually it's kind of real squishy, and lots of liquid coming out of it. All right, so I'm going to cut this a little bit here, and so you can see. So, see, it's kind of like a sponge. Look how spongy that is. I bet you if I put this in a bowl of water, it would probably float because of all the air still trapped in there. Right here, you can see those holes, right? So these are some of the bronchioles going in. And if you felt it, you could feel they're kind of hard right there where this is kind of really... All right, I think we're going. So this is...
Yeah, see, so it restarted on its own. Sorry about that. But I think you got to see what I was talking about. I was near the end of that part of the looking at the lungs right there. I was going to come back up and cut into the trachea, which I did. I actually cut into there so that you could, continue that way. So sorry that cut off right there. My phone said no more. But you saw how that tissue, and when I squeezed it, I don't know if you could tell when I squeezed it, some fluid came up through it. Okay, so that reminds me to tell you that there's fluid inside your lung naturally. Now, not like with pneumonia. That fluid, of course, is very dangerous. But inside the alveoli, it's actually lined with a little bit of fluid, and that fluid actually keeps the alveolus open. That's kind of strange because there's a little bit of water and then a little bit of something called surfactant. Surfactant is really kind of like soap. And so this kind of soapy water is keeping the alveolus open just exactly when it needs to be open. We don't want it to collapse down, okay? We don't want it to get too big, all right? So there are other diseases that cause the alveoli to get too big, and then you have less oxygen exchange on there because we have fewer alveoli. All right, so that is our study of the respiratory system. This was 14B. So remember, that means that next week you will have a quiz over this. Now, next week, I'll send the lecture to you. Next week, we're actually going to go straight over to Module 16. I flip 15 and 16 because 15 doesn't have any labs. And because of that, that's when I do the rat dissection, okay? So we'll have 15A and 15B at the very end. And I even mix those up a little bit, I think. We'll get to that. I'll let you know. So next week, we'll actually be talking about the brain and the nervous system. All right, everybody. I hope that it all goes well. And I'll send you that quiz for next week, right? Not this week. Okay, very good.